Hey, what's up, Crossroads kids? We're here for week 4 of Digging Deeper with Mr. B. And if you remember, we've been talking about one word this whole time, and that's been the word humility. And last week on Easter Sunday, we saw the ultimate example of humility when Jesus put himself on the cross for you and me. And this week, we're going to continue talking about humility, but this isn't so much a story. We're actually going to be looking at a letter that Paul wrote, okay? And we're going to be breaking it down verse by verse and talking about what this verse means for being humble or showing humility. So let's get into our verse, or our verses for this week. So before we get into our story today, I actually want to tell you a little story. A lot of people don't know this, but I used to work at McDonald's for a few years, okay? And so when I worked at McDonald's, I took advantage of my job. All right, so employees, people that work there, would get free food, okay? And so my friend and I that worked there, we would make these crazy sandwiches, okay? And so I would start off with a big bun, all right? Then I would put a huge piece of meat, and then a slice of cheese, and then 2 strips of bacon. Okay? And you're like, oh, that's not that much. Then I would go and put Big Mac sauce on it. Boom. And then I would go get another piece of meat. Boom. Then I would get another piece of cheese. Boom. Then I would put 2 more pieces of bacon. Boom, boom. Then, it's not done yet, I would take a chicken patty. Boom. Put it on top of that. Then cheese, and 2 more slices of bacon. Bang, bang. And so this sandwich would be like this big. I would need to have it like in a special box, okay? And it was I took advantage of my job because that's not something that everybody could do. Not everybody could go and make that sandwich. You can't go and order that. So that was something only somebody who worked there, who didn't really have to pay for the food, could do. And that's a really crazy example. But today we're going to learn about how Jesus, even though he's the Son of God, he did not take advantage of being the Son of God. Instead of acting like a God on earth, he acted like a humble servant.
Did you know that the Apostle Paul didn't only write the letter to the Philippians, but he wrote 13 other letters in our Bible today? Wowee!
So like I said, this week we are going to be talking about some verses that Paul wrote. This is a letter that he wrote. So back in Bible times, they didn't have cell phones and email and FaceTime like we do now, and especially right now that we've been using so much. But they had to write letters. So Paul would write letters to different churches because all these churches were trying to learn how to be Christians and how to live like Jesus, because Jesus had just died not that long ago at this time. And so he's teaching them how to live like Jesus, okay? And he writes this letter that we're going to be reading today to the church of Philippi, okay? Can you say Philippi? Yeah, Philippi. So that's why it's called the book of Philippians. Now, today's verses are super, super important, okay? And they're so important, and since they're a letter, I thought to myself, how can I make this stick with me? And so what I'm going to do this week, and do not do this at home, is I thought, since this is a written letter, and I really want to remember this verse, I am going to roll up my sleeves here, and I'm going to write each of these verses on my arm, so that at the end of this video, I'm going to have my whole arm filled with all these verses that Paul sent to the church in Philippi in the book of Philippians. So let's get started with our verses for today. So we are going to be reading from the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verses 3 through 8. So if you have your Bible, you can go and get that right now. Pause the video and turn to Philippians, chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 3 through 8. So our first verse that we're going to look at today is Philippians 2, verse 3. We're going to start there. And this is what Philippians 2:3 says. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. So this first verse is basically just our life app. Show humility. Put others first. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that verse on my arm. So verse 1 is there. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. My handwriting is not that good, but do not do this at home. Now, verse 4 is kind of saying the same thing. It's kind of using the same point. And this is what verse 4 says. It says, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of others. So this is saying, don't look at what you really, really want. We need to be looking at what others want, putting others first. Okay, this is just like our life app. This goes perfectly with verse 3. All right, it's just saying, put others first. All right, so now we're going to look at verse 5, okay? So these first two verses have talked about what we need to do, and this verse is going to keep talking about us, okay? So listen to this. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ. Whoa, that is a big, big verse. It's saying that in our relationships, in our friendships, with our brothers and sisters, with our parents, we need to have the same mindset that Jesus had. And remember, Jesus showed humility every single day perfectly. So we need to do our best to show humility. That's what verse 5 is saying. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Wow. Alright, so now let's go to verse 6, okay? And this is where it's going to change from talking about you and me of what we need to do to showing how Jesus showed humility. Okay, so the next 3 verses are talking all about Jesus. So we really have to listen up. If we want to have a mindset like Jesus, then we need to hear how did Jesus show humility. So let's check out verse 6. Verse 6 says this. Jesus, being in the very nature of God, so it means he was just like God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Wow. So this is talking about how Jesus, he could have stopped all of this bad stuff from happening. He was God, okay, but he didn't consider himself that. He decided, I'm not going to use all of those things to make me better. I'm going to still put others first, even though I could stop whatever I want because I am God and I have a relationship with God. I'm not going to stop any of that because I am showing humility. Whoa. So now we are on to verse 7. I really, really want you to hear this verse because it says this. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, by being made in human likeness. So this is saying Jesus, not only was he putting others first, he was putting himself as a servant. So that means he was trying to serve everyone around him. Okay? And if you know, back in Bible times, they had servants, and servants were the lowest people in the house. They were there to do work for everybody else. Okay? So Jesus is saying, I'm going to be a servant to everyone. And so Paul is really showing us how important it is to be like Jesus and to be a servant. All right? So let me add that verse to my arm. I might have to go change my shirt because I'm running out of room here. All right, so I changed my shirt so I have enough space on the rest of my arm to write the rest of this verse. So let's recap so far, okay? So the first 3 verses are talking about you and I and how we need to put others first in our relationship. The last 2 verses we've talked about how Jesus did this perfectly. And remember, he came as a servant. Okay? He came as a servant to serve everybody around him. So let's read our last verse for today. And the last verse is right here. It's Philippians chapter 2, verse 8. Okay? And it says this. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So this final verse, it's showing us a couple things. First, he came and he humbled himself. That's that word humility that we've been talking about our life app. Okay, so he humbled himself, and then he humbled himself so much that even though he didn't deserve it, he died on a cross for you and me. The perfect example of humility. Okay? So, this letter from Paul, these verses that we're reading, are super important on how we understand how to show humility. So let me write this last verse on my arm. Hopefully I have enough space here. And then we're going to finish up. So now that we have read Paul's letter to the Philippians and read all of these verses, okay, I want to talk about what can we do with this, okay? Because Jesus' example of humility is a tough one to follow, right? He showed the perfect example, but what can we do each and every day to act like a servant and show humility? So let me give you a couple examples. And one thing I've seen that's really cool right now is there's a lot of kids who are making like masks for everybody so that they don't get sick. And so they're making these masks. Even though these people that they're giving the masks to are complete strangers, they're serving them by giving them something that they might not be able to make. Another thing could be maybe, even though it's not your room, you go and help your brother clean up their room. Or after dinner, you clean off the table, okay? Or if someone's behind you in line, letting someone get in front of you in line, okay? These are all really small things that we can do each and every day. Remember, Paul says we need to have the mindset of Christ, okay? That means we have to be thinking, how can I serve? Because that's what Jesus thought the whole time he was on earth was, how can I serve others? So this week, my challenge for you is to find ways to serve. Show humility to everybody around you. So remember, I was talking about how I worked at McDonald's, right? And I would make all these crazy sandwiches. I took advantage of working there, okay? Most people don't get to eat these things that I was making, but I took advantage of working there and got it super, super cheap and all this stuff. And I just took advantage of my job, okay? But Jesus didn't do that. He did not take advantage of him being the Son of God. Like I said, he could have just said, no, I'm not going to die on this cross. I'm not going to do this. I can do whatever I want. I'm the Son of God. But he didn't take advantage of that. Jesus lived his life as a humble servant. That is what we have to remember. And that's what is so amazing about the Easter story that we learned last week. My other challenge for you this week is write a letter to somebody. Ooh, that's something we don't do a lot now, but after reading this letter that was so important, I want you to try to think of somebody right now that you could write a letter to. Maybe it's your grandparents, your aunt, your uncle, one of your friends that live far away, and think about what could you say to them. Or maybe you could just be really nice and be a servant and just giving them kind words and tell them how awesome they are. Okay? So I want you to try to write a letter. Now, do not write your letter on your arm. Do not do this, because this is not going to come off. In my next video, you're probably still going to be able to see this verse. This was just a silly thing to do for me. Okay? But this week, try to write a letter to somebody. And definitely, if you do that, take a picture. We love to see the letters that you're sending to people that you care about. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for joining me for another week. And I will see you again next week for our last week of talking about humility. See you guys.